Okay, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the background and content of First and Second Kings. So we'll begin here, first of all, by understanding a little bit about the composition of this book. So these two books, along with First and Second Samuel, in the Hebrew Bible, form the single book known as the Kings. Then these books later on got separated into the four books in the Septuagint, and so that became the influence then for why these books are separated and divided and titled as they are currently in the English Bibles. The authorship of First and Second Kings is unknown, just like with First and Second Samuel, though Jewish tradition later attributed the authorship of these books to the prophet Jeremiah, so somewhere around the 7th century. So once again, there may have been this tendency to see certain writings and give them an air of authority or legitimacy, why they are going to be considered as scripture, why they're going to be considered as somehow or another divine writings, and so trying to attribute them to recognized authority figures. These books are representative of the Deuteronomistic history perspective that we have seen in other books, so certainly like the book of Deuteronomy, as well as Joshua and Judges, and in First and Second Samuel. And this is helping to emphasize Deuteronomy's view of divine blessings and curses. So if you obey the law, then you are blessed, or the people are blessed. And if the people disobey God's law, then curses will follow. And also the centrality of the temple. In other words, Israelite faith prohibit having altars or sacred spaces in other places, and that the only place where God is to be worshipped with sacrifices is going to be at the temple in one location. The time frame that's covered by these books range from 970 BC, so this is the start of the United Kingdom under Saul and David and Solomon, and it's going to go all the way up to 561 BC. So this is the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is going to take the reader all the way through even not only the devastation of the northern kingdom, that's Israel, by the Assyrians, but also the takeover of Judah by the Babylonians. So Nebuchadnezzar then is associated with the Babylonian kingdom, and so the Babylonians basically destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple in 586 BC, and so this is going to take the reader past that time. So you can see why it's probably not likely that, or makes it somewhat more unbelievable that it's Jeremiah the prophet who's responsible for this work. So anyway, there's that time frame that this book covers. So why did the kingdom divide? You can see here on the map that I have, you have both Judah in the south and Israel in the north. I would direct you to read in our textbook, which is Survey of the Old Testament, and the author's descriptions about Solomon's policies and how some of Solomon's policies led to the tensions, to the unhappiness. So Solomon, once again, not only had the centralized temple, but he also forced more centralized government, and also the taxation that took place under Solomon. So according to 1st and 2nd Kings, the northern kingdom, Israel, was an unstable kingdom. All of its rulers, they're not lasting very long, and they were all evil because of their support of Jeroboam's cult of the golden calf. So we're going to have two figures that arise after Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is this servant who basically is going to kind of lead, this one half of the Israelites into a rebellion against the Davidic monarchy represented by Rehoboam. And so Rehoboam is going to kind of have control of Judah. So you can see some of the tribes there as they're also associated with these two kingdoms. So you've got Benjamin and Judah and Simeon that are all associated with the southern kingdom, and you have Dan and Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulon, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh. So you've got all these other groups that are associated with Israel. So the Assyrians are going to conquer Israel in 900 BC. And so that's going to be the end of them, and with 586 BC being the end of the southern kingdom. All right, so when it comes to the themes in 1st and 2nd Kings, so I've again want to associate two particular scriptures with this book for you to kind of remember and associate. So the first one out of 1st Kings is God said to him, and he's referring here to Solomon, if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life. So again, this is a reflection of the Deuteronomistic view of history, that God holds leaders of his people accountable to and walk in his ways, this keeping his statutes, his commandments, referring to the law. Now, of course, David did several things in his life where he did not keep God's statutes, he did not keep God's commandments. He was engaged in adultery, he was responsible for murder. So there's lots of things where David violated the law. But by and large, 1st Kings is remembering David as a king who sought after God and tried to follow God in much of his walk. So not looking at specific huge incidences in David's life, but overall David's life and this desire to follow God's commandments. So the same charge is to Solomon. But Solomon, unfortunately, is going to do something that does threaten the integrity of the kingdom. So he's going to have lots of political marriages. He's going to have lots of wives and concubines. And these he does in order to stay off potential threats from his neighbors, because he's marrying the wives of the kings or the rulers of these neighbors. But because he marries or brings into his harem or into the palace these concubines, what they do is they bring their gods. So once again, the big sin that Israel must stay away from is idolatry, and here is the ruler who is still going to, walk in God's way, but he's foolishly bringing these women with their gods into the royal palace, royal influence. So we don't have Solomon worshiping these idols, but we do have him cozying up, as it were, to them, allowing them to be brought in. The other passage is out of 2 Kings 23, 25, now and before him Josiah. So in terms of kings associated with Israel, Of course, there's Saul, who is the first king that um, the story of Samuel begins with. And then there's, of course, David, who is the classical or the golden age king. Then you have Solomon, who does a lot of things that may seem to be wise as far as forming a government, forming a kingdom, strengthening a kingdom. And so he is the heir of the Davidic kingdom. But then it crumbles. And then with Israel, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, most kings or many kings are not walking in the ways of God. They're not following his statutes, not keeping his commandments. But Josiah is different. Josiah then is this kind of reprieve. Here is a king who is going to be remembered by Second Kings as wanting to turn not only himself and the palace, but also the people back to the Lord. So before him, Josiah, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart. And so this kind of remembers the language of David, who pursues God with his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might. So here's this kind of language that we find in Deuteronomy, to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, might, strength. And so here is Josiah being described as someone who does try to do that. According to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So Second Kings, or the author of Second Kings, clearly is in favor of Josiah as a reformer of the people, who kind of laid the path that Israel should follow. So he's the one. He is the king who is held up the most by this author. Although David is certainly seen as a very important king, Josiah seems to outshine because of the way he's described here at the end. So according to these books, the southern kingdom of Judah had rulers. All except one were Davidic. That is, they somehow or another traced their line back through David. And they all reigned for a long time. And the kingdom lasted longer than Israel. But only 8 are called good. And by good, they mean they're obeying God's laws and statutes. These books then give special attention to the role of prophets of Yahweh. And so the prophets who are mentioned in 1st and 2nd Kings are Elijah, Elisha, of course, Jonah, who's has a book and called Jonah, talks about him being swallowed by a great fish. And then the prophet Isaiah, who is a very important prophet who we'll talk about in another class period. All of these are attempting to hold rulers accountable. So the author who composed First and 2nd Kings, who brought together lots of materials in order to compose it, is wanting to kind of set the stage for future rulers, that if they will walk in the ways of God's statutes, God's laws, God is going to bless them. They'll be remembered well, and to pay heed to prophets, and that prophets who hold kings accountable should be revered. They should be honored. The prophet's voice is an important voice. The Babylonians then conquered Judah in 586 BC. So in our course, lots of dates are thrown at you, and I don't really require students to memorize lots of different dates. But if there is one date in this course that I would want students to remember, to have it drilled into their heads, it is 586 or 587 BCE, because that is a very decisive date that changed, as it were, Israelites' faith in very dramatic ways. So the people who are living in Judah are going to be exiled, or many of the people who are living in Judah are going to be exiled And these exiles are going to maintain this faith, or they're going to develop this faith. It's going to take on different ideas while they are living under the Babylonians and then under the Persians. And when this group who have been exiled return back to the land, they are going to bring with them some new emphasis, new ideas, new kind of commitments, new expressions, new languages, new institutions. So there's a lot of changes that will take place amongst who will become known as Jews after 586. So here is Judah, this kingdom, the southern kingdom, that is finally going to be demolished by the Babylonians in 586, and something new is going to arise when these exiles return decades later back to this land under the Persians. So we will leave that. That ends our review over First and Second Kings.